Yeah, look, I wrote a thing, but I just want to speak from the heart, I guess. I think, and I've spoken here before to different politicians on this issue, and as I said in my brief introduction to myself, I wouldn't be aligned with a lot of people in this room in terms of their politics, particularly around LGBTI issues and other issues, but I'm here because as a disabled person, I am so deeply concerned about what this legislation will mean for my community and for people with disabilities. So I'm here even when it makes me politically uncomfortable in kind of every other front. For me, this idea of burden and how we decide who is a burden and the cultural narratives that we have around disability as burden is really, really important. And I don't think that non-disabled people really understand the ways in which those ideas impact on our lives, throughout our lives. My parents are left-wing and lovely and really alternative in a lot of ways and super supportive of me being a massive queer. But when it comes to disability, they've internalized a lot of this ableist stuff around me being a burden on them, my life being a terrible tragedy. And I was home this time last year, actually, and I finally sat them down and I said to them, look, I know that my birth was a surprise. I know that you weren't expecting for me to have the body that I do, that it was traumatic for you. But I'm no longer traumatized. I live a really rich and interesting and full life. I have a wonderful community. I have a beautiful partner. I do work that I feel inherently proud of for LGBTI and disability rights. Engage with some of this stuff. Talk to me about some of this stuff. Let's process some of this idea of disability as tragedy that you've held on so tightly because the medical profession told you that's how you should understand disability when I was born. And let's rethink it about an issue of rights and identity. And we had quite a lengthy conversation for the first time in my life, really, because it had made them feel uncomfortable whenever I brought up kind of the rights-based work that I do previously. We talked for a couple of hours. And the culmination of that conversation was when my father said to me, just because you don't think you're a burden doesn't mean we don't see you as one. And I'd been brilliantly articulate and tried to find interesting ways of getting them to engage and think through some of their assumptions about disability. And at that point, I just went, there's nothing I can say. There is nothing I can say that is going to help you reframe what you think you know disability to be. I mean, they said a number of other things in that conversation, one of which was, I have an able-bodied partner and they're convinced that she's going to leave me at any moment because she'll suddenly realise that I'm a wheelchair user and she could get someone normal and better. But I think assumptions like these, that the people closest to us hold about the value of our lives, are at the core of the danger of some of this legislation. I mean, I've been spending fun times reading wrongful birth cases in Victoria, where parents have a disabled child and then sue the medical profession for not informing them of the fact that they could give birth to a disabled child. And for me, that shows how ingrained ableism is and how terrified potential parents are of this idea of what a life with a disability could mean for them and their family, but also these ideas of burden and burden on the system and suffering. How do we define these things? Currently, we define them based on fear, and based on fear of the other or fear of becoming disabled and what that will actually mean. And it's not actually often a lived experience of that person. It's based on this fear and these cultural narratives and representations of disability as a terrible tragedy, of disability as a burden, of disability being better off dead than disabled. And for me, all those things play into our mental health, how we feel about ourselves, the access to services and supports that we might or might not have. Currently in Victoria, we don't have all the services and supports we need to live well. And supposedly the NDIS will bring some of those in, but what will happen when there's gaps there? What will happen when we're not getting the services and supports that we want, that we need? I recently applied through my local council, because I'm not in an NDIS area just yet, for some home care services. And they came out and they sat down with us and they said to me and my partner, would you define your relationship as, is she your carer or is she your partner, first and foremost? And I said, well, she's my partner because we're equal, you know, she's my partner. She does some caring tasks for me and she does some work around the house that I can't do, but she's my partner first. And they said, oh, because you didn't say she was your carer and solely your carer, you're not eligible for any of these services. So I think it's really concerning when there is power imbalances that are built into our relationships and our lives in a myriad of ways because of a system that doesn't support us to live fully, live well, and live with equality. And I'm really, really deeply concerned what that will mean for people with disabilities. I've had periods of severe depression when I was younger, and my family has a long history of depression. And as a young person, when I first presented at a mental health unit after attempting suicide and said, I'm depressed, you know, my grandma committed suicide, I've got a long history of people experiencing that, I need some medication. They said, oh, well, it's just because you're a wheelchair user and we can understand why you'd want to die being a wheelchair user. And this was delivered to me from the head psychiatrist who was sitting in my chair at the time because I was too weak to get out of bed, and said, you know, we could understand if you would want to die. So these assumptions and these very real conversations that happen in our lives as people with disabilities, from the people that should be closest to us and providing support and assistance for us to live with a quality of life, are not, that they're very real. They're not kind of something that we're imagining or something that could potentially happen. They're happening now, and they're happening before this legislation is actually in law. So we need to say no to this, even when it's hard. We need to say no.